What such imagining vaguely has in mind in the case of this subterfuge is the true thought which in fact abolishes that imagining, namely, that being as such is not the truth of spirit at all. Just as the disposition is itself an original being which has no part in the activity of spirit, just such a being is the bone on its side. What merely is, without any spiritual activity, is for consciousness a thing, and far from being the essence of consciousness, is rather its opposite, and consciousness is only actual to itself through the negation and abolition of such a being. From this point of view, it must be regarded as a complete denial of reason to pass off a bone as the actual existence of consciousness, and it is passed off as such when it is regarded as the outer being of spirit, for the outer is just that reality which merely is. It is no use saying that the inner is only being inferred from the outer and is something different, nor that the outer is not the inner itself, but only its expression. For in the relation of the two to one another, the determination of the reality that thinks itself and is in the form of thought does fall on the side of the inner. But on the side of the outer falls the determination of the reality which merely is. When therefore a man is told, your inner being, are this kind of person because your skull bone is constituted in such and such a way, this means nothing else than, I regard a bone as your reality. To reply to such a judgment with a box on the ear, as in the case of a similar judgment in physiognomy mentioned above, at first takes away from the soft parts their importance and position, and proves only that these are no true in itself, are not the reality of spirit. The retort here would, strictly speaking, have to go the length of beating in the skull of anyone making such a judgment, in order to demonstrate in a manner just as palpable as his wisdom, that for a man a bone is nothing in itself, much less his true reality. In the paragraphs leading up to paragraph 339, Hegel has drawn a strong distinction between what can be imagined, and he thinks that phrenology and physiognomy have really worked within the realm of the imagination, and what can be thought, and thought in a more strict, rigorous manner, what's going to actually provide us with science or Wissenschaft. And he criticized a subterfuge, a sort of contradictory status that physiognomy and phrenology were arriving at, based on this distinction between imagination and thought. So he says, what we're losing sight of is something that will actually abolish this imagining. And on the one side we have, I should have put over here, on the one side we have being, or sein. What it is that we've seen that spirit is not. Now that doesn't mean that spirit doesn't exist, but spirit doesn't have the being that is just a being, you might say. And so he says that what's been lost sight of is that being as such is not the truth of spirit at all. What does that mean? Well, among other things, you cannot reduce what Hegel is calling spirit, Geist, mind. You cannot reduce this merely to something that could be an object for the mind, that is a being, which then can be grasped, however you want to put it, by the intellect, by the mind, written down, represented somewhere, maybe digitized, and all that sort of stuff that we do today. None of these are going to be adequate to what is going on with spirit, in part because spirit is not only something to be thought, it's also the thing that's doing the thinking when it's trying to conceptualize itself. And so there's always going to be some, you might say, not just indeterminacy, but an overdetermination there that the logic of being simply is not adequate to. So this is a larger point than just about phrenology or physiognomy. So he goes on, returning back to those, though. He says, what merely is without any spiritual activity is, for consciousness, a thing. That's what it means to be a thing. It doesn't have any agency. It doesn't have any interior reflectiveness of its own. So he says, far from being the essence of consciousness, it's rather its opposite. And this is an interesting point to dwell on. We see all sorts of interesting attempts throughout the history of philosophy, and particularly once psychology emerges as its own discipline, to try to say we could reduce consciousness or the objects of consciousness, our ideas or our experiences or something like that, to something that we can figure as just being or types of beings. Hegel is resisting that. There won't be any adequate explanation that isn't already, you might say, a thinking explanation, which means that it's not something that can be purely externalized, put into a textbook, and then just learned, right? Or turned into algorithms, which then could be programmed into a computer. That's not to say that perhaps we couldn't create artificial intelligence or something along those lines, but that's not going to be the way that artificial intelligence actually ends up happening. There'll have to be something else going on. So he goes on, and he says, from this point of view, it must be regarded as a complete denial of reason to pass off a bone as the actual existence of consciousness. So if reason was, as we're starting to come to a close now with this entire section, if reason is what happens after self-consciousness goes through all this dialectical processes and consciousness realizes that this entire plenum of being is for it because it can extend itself into the intelligibility that's there, and we saw that that can be quite complex. Well, that means that if reason is going to be satisfied, it cannot really be satisfied by being given an explanation of consciousness, of spirit, of whatever you like, in terms of something that's purely physical, something that's manifest just as a thing. So he goes on and he says, look, you can't pass off a bone like the skull as spirit, and it doesn't work when you talk about this outer and inner stuff. He says, there's no use saying that the inner is only being inferred from the outer and is something different, because you're not really saying that it's something different anyway. It may be something different in that it's, goop inside your head, your brain cells, but you're saying that it has the same configuration as something that you're observing externally. So he says, nor that the outer is not the inner itself, but only its expression. That's not going to work. And here's where it gets very interesting. So he says, in the relation of the two to one another, the determination of the reality that thinks itself and is in the form of thought, right? So reality that thinks itself, that is thought. The German for that is that this is a reality that is sich denkenden and gedachten. And that's a little bit stronger than Miller's formulation here. It literally thinks itself and is thought in the process. It's not just thought as the substantive of the activity, like a faculty of thinking. It is thought. That's a past participle there. It has been thought. It is, you might say, what it thinks itself to be, and it takes into account that very process of thinking itself to be. That's something totally different than the purely objective existence of a skull, right? And this is where we get to very interesting observations that Hegel's not really making here, but ought to give us some pause when we think about the brain and trying to reduce consciousness to just brain states or something like that. Hegel might actually be receptive to reduction of consciousness to brain states, but he would say, yeah, the brain is way more complicated than a lot of you think it is, because you're treating it as if it's just something like the skull or like a computer or like, and we can add whatever other metaphors we like in here, and not looking at it in its own respect as the locus where thinking about its own self does in fact take place, right? If you can't have that reflexive part of it, and that's you don't have to be very smart to have that sort of reflexivity going on. It's necessary to our ordinary existence. And that's just for thinking about yourself. That's not even like bringing in other people, the other that we've talked about in the self-consciousness section that we're going to talk about here, the other that's necessary for spirit. All of that is mediated for Hegel through the brain, which means that the brain can't be something like the skull. So he goes on, and he says, all of this realization, on the side of the outer falls the determination of the reality which merely is, right? So we've got something super interesting and dynamic going on here. Over here we got bones. And bones are cool, but bones are just bones. They could have been made out of metal instead of bone. They have certain configurations. Great. That's about it. So he says, when therefore a man is told, your inner being, are this kind of person because your skull bone is constituted in such and such a way, this means nothing else than, there's a reduction going on here. I regard a bone as your reality. I regard a bone as who and what you are. I'm going to forget the fact that you're a thinking being. Not just a being that thinks about other stuff, but a being that thinks about itself. And thereby modifies itself in the process. I'm going to ignore all that stuff and say, you're this bump. You're the criminal bump. You're the poet bump. You're the whatever bump. You're the chef bump. You're the military commander bump. You're the good friend bump. You're the bad friend bump. Pick whatever you want. And Hegel says, the appropriate reaction to this, earlier he said, the appropriate reaction is to punch the guy in the side of the head, give him a box on the ear, right? Or you can smack him, I suppose. Here he says, if you really wanted to take that seriously, you would need something that would go in and hit him so hard it would modify the skull. Because somebody who thinks that all we are walking skulls, that's the only way to reach somebody like that. That's essentially what he's saying here in his joking around a little bit. So he says, the retort here would, strictly speaking, have to go the length of beating in the skull of anyone making such a judgment in order to demonstrate in a manner just as palpable as his wisdom that for a man a bone is nothing in itself, still less his true reality. We are, in fact, our bodies, right? We are our skulls. But we're sure not just our skulls. And our skulls are not the royal road or the key or anything, whatever metaphor you want to use for deciphering what is actually going on in our individuality and in our processes of thinking and action. The crude instinct of self-conscious reason will reject out of hand such a science of phrenology, this other observational instinct of self-conscious reason, which, having attained to a glimpse of the cognitive process, has grasped it unintelligently in a way that takes the outer to be the expression of the inner. But the worse the conception, the less sometimes does it occur to one wherein its badness specifically lies, and the harder it is to analyze it. For a conception is said to be worse, the purer and emptier the abstraction which is taken to be its essence. But the antithesis we are here concerned with has for its sides the individuality that is conscious of itself and the abstraction of externality that has become wholly a thing, that inner being of spirit grasped as a fixed non-spiritual being opposed to such a being. But reason in its role of observer, having reached thus far, seems also to have reached its peak, at which point it must abandon itself and do a right-about turn. For only what is wholly bad is implicitly charged with the immediate necessity of changing round into its opposite. Just so it may be said of the Jewish people that it is precisely because they stand before the portal of salvation that they are and have been the most reprobate and rejected. What that people should be in and for itself, this essential nature of its own self, is not explicitly present to it. On the contrary, it places it beyond itself. By this alienation, it creates for itself the possibility of a higher existence, if only it could take back again into itself its alienated object, than if it had remained undisturbed within the immediacy of being. Because spirit is all the greater the opposition from which it is returned into itself. But it creates this opposition for itself by setting aside its immediate unity, and by alienating its being for self. However, if such a consciousness does not reflect on itself, the intermediate position or middle term which it occupies is an unhappy void, since what should fill and fulfill it has been turned into a fixed extreme. Thus it is that this final stage of reason in its observational role is its worst, and this is why its reversal becomes a necessity. One of the lessons that we can draw from paragraph 340, which Hegel is not completely spelling out at this point, is that phrenology and physiognomy and the sort of mindset and approach and assumptions that have gone along with them are not a total loss unless we assume them to be the final word on things, in which case we wind up with what he was talking about at the end, this middle term that doesn't get us anywhere, and this is a big loss for us, right? But if we understand what has been going on, if we step back a little bit as phenomenologists and think about what's been going on in this process of examining the way in which consciousness would use these pseudosciences to try to make sense out of its own individuality, and thereby also the individuality of other people, then we have the sort of, we might call it archetypal Hegelian progression that goes on. And before people start, getting too much, into the framework of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, let's say two things right off the bat. One is that Hegel does point out an antithesis, but it's not an antithesis of this term to this term. Rather, this term itself is finding out that there's an antithesis there. And you can say, well, okay, that's an antithesis over here. Then we've got antithesis in two different ways. The second thing to say is that Hegel in the Phenomenology doesn't talk about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Instead, what he talks about much more often is a triadic movement, but it's a triadic movement first of the in itself, or of a starting point, then of an estrangement or alienation, an Entfremdung, it's a sort of a technical term. And then there's some sort of reconciliation, of bringing things back together, Versöhnung, which occurs. And this is only being sketched out here. It's not really being elaborated. That's going to happen in the paragraphs yet to come. So let's run our way through what he's saying now. He says, this crude instinct of self-conscious reason is going to reject out of hand any sort of science of phrenology, the way that we've been sketching it out so far. This other observational instinct of self-conscious reason, which having attained to a glimpse of the cognitive process, has grasped it unintelligently in a way that takes the outer to be the expression of the inner. So what we have is reason able to realize that one of the ways that it wanted to go about its task, and this had to happen, Hegel thinks, historically, because it's necessary to try things out. It's necessary to try to follow the instinct of reason. And we saw permutation after permutation after permutation of the outer is the expression of the inner, attempted to be provided as laws. We saw that it just doesn't work out like that. And then what did we see after that? He says, the worse the conception, the less sometimes does it occur to one wherein its badness specifically lies, and the harder it is to analyze it. Now that's a good point. Oftentimes, we're not able to see what's wrong with a particular point of view that we're using, and seems to work for us a bit, until we have another perspective to bring to bear on it. And only after we bring that other perspective to bear can we say, oh, wow, I was really off. I was more off than I thought I was. The perspective that I had wasn't just wrong in this one way that this other perspective fixes. it was wrong in this way, and this way, and this way, and this one over here blinded me to how screwed up everything else was. That's very typical. That happens all the time in any sort of development. I think that's a really important general point that Hegel is bringing up here. One that applies just as much to technical processes as it does to virtue ethics, as it does to advances in music. I mean, we can talk about things till we're blue in the face about those sorts of examples. So he says, a conception is said to be worse. What makes it worse? The purer and emptier the abstraction which is taken to be its essence. Now notice that for a lot of philosophers, the purer and more abstract it is, the better it is. Not for Hegel. Hegel thinks if we want to, and here Hegel, let me preface this is sort of an aside. Here Hegel is placing himself within a long, loose tradition of philosophers who think that you don't do philosophy well by getting away from reality that you have to take in. You don't just come up with a bunch of ideas and then press them onto reality and say, so much the worse for reality. You've got to take your cues from reality. Who would that include? Aristotle, for one, right? In the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas would be another great example. In the early modern period, who might you look to? I would say Blaise Pascal is a great example of that sort of thing. And finally, in the 19th century, we have Hegel on the scene saying you got to take account of everything, and that's actually where the Hegelian system shows its weaknesses. It's not in what it does well. It's where it has sometimes failed to go as far as it could in grasping concrete individuality. That's Kierkegaard's complaint. In grasping what's going on in material economic processes. That's Marx's complaint. In making sense out of what's really happening in terms of the individual and enlightenment and religion. That's Maurice Blondel's point. We can go on and on and on. But all of those are working off of a Hegel who went about as far as that you can go with this, in part because he rejected pure empty abstraction. He said, that's just a starting point. That's not where philosophy ought to remain. So, where do we go from there? He says, the antithesis we are here concerned with has for its sides the individuality that's conscious of itself. That's what we're trying to make sense of. That's what the instinct of reason really wants to grasp, because it's important. How do we make sense out of individuality? We saw earlier we had these laws of thought, and they're nice, but we want to make sense of individuals and how they arrive at their self-determining decisions and how they express themselves. And we've been doing this like looking at skulls and bodily shapes. So the individual conscious of itself and the thing. Or you like spirit and the skull. Right? So he goes on and he says, the inner being of spirit grasped as a fixed non-spiritual being opposed to such a being, that's what the thing is. It's something that is coming from spirit, turning against spirit, and trying to be made into a replacement of it. So he says, reason in its role of observer, having reached thus far, also seems to have reached its peak. So it tried here, and then we had the antithesis, or the estrangement coming about, the alienation. Reason, if it's been paying attention to what's going on, realizes, I got myself into quite a pickle. This looks like an aporia, a place where I'm not going to get out of. And it could just, then lapse into skepticism, couldn't it? So he goes on and he says, at this point it has to abandon itself and do a right about turn, for only what is wholly bad is implicitly charged with the immediate necessity of changing round into its opposite. And that's part of what's going to happen here. It realizes, I wanted to have this unifying conception of things. Now I'm stuck with this, distinction here that I'm not really able to make sense of. Even worse, I'm this thing here trying to make sense of this and this at the same time. And now Hegel has this comparison to the Jewish people If you think about what he's trying to say here by way of comparison, so in Christian doctrine, and this is something that is essentially reflected in Jewish doctrine and coming out of it, the Jews are the people who God has the highest expectations of. And precisely because they are, like he says, at the portal of salvation, when they screw up, it's a big deal. They really, really screw it up. And they're if you just read the Old Testament sometime, particularly read Kings and Chronicles, and actually read Judges and read other stuff too. And you're going to see that there never is a case where God is like totally satisfied with the Israelites or the Judeans or whoever, because they're always like one step away from totally screwing it up. And why is that the case? It's because, unlike all the other people surrounding them, they are the chosen ones. They're where progress is supposed to be happening. So if the Canaanites want to do their nature religion and engage in their wars and oppress their neighbors and do all this sort of stuff, that's it's not good. Nobody's saying that's fine, and they do have according to the natural law, they should know what they're doing, but they're not the ones who had a sort of revelation given to them, a direct connection. And so he says, by this alienation, it creates for itself the possibility of a higher existence. If only it could take back into itself its alienated object, than if it had remained undisturbed within the immediacy of being. So what Hegel is talking about here is this Hegelian three-step that happens of starting point, estrangement, realization that something is being lost, something is being threatened, something is becoming problematic, and then some sort of reconciliation that takes back what was there in the first place, but transforms it in the process. This is Aufhebung. This is sublation. This is what's going on. And he says, here we go, spirit is all the greater the opposition from which it is returned into itself. So it's not as if you can skip this step and just jump right past it into the reconciliation. This is one of the key points of the Hegelian dialectic. This is the dark night, right, that you have to pass through. And lacking that, there can't be this brilliant dawn on the other side. So he says, it creates the opposition for itself by setting aside its immediate unity and alienating its being for self. But there's a danger here. If such a consciousness, he says, does not reflect upon itself, it's not going to get over here. It's going to remain oscillating back and forth between these two in what in other places Hegel calls a bad infinity. It's never going to arrive at the finish point. Self-consciousness is required for that, reflection upon itself. He says, if it doesn't do that, the intermediate position or middle term which it occupies is an unhappy void, since what should fill and fulfill it has been turned into a fixed extreme. Again, the oscillation back and forth. And he says that thus it is that this final stage of reason in its observational role is its worst. And this is why its reversal becomes a necessity. So what's going on here in the critique of phrenology and physiognomy, and really a critique that Hegel could levy against anything similarly worked out in our own time or in the future, is, like he said, this instinct of self-conscious reason that has found that it went into a blind alley. And now we have to figure out how to get past that and get to some place where there's some paths ahead. For a survey of the series of relations considered so far which constitute the content and object of observation shows that in their first form, that is, in the observation of the relations of inorganic nature, sensuous being is already lost to view. The moments of the relations present themselves as pure abstractions and as simple notions which should be firmly tied to the existence of things, an existence, however, which gets lost, so that the moment demonstrates itself to be a pure moment and a universal. This free process, which is complete within itself, retains the significance of something objective, but now appears as a unitary being. In the process of the inorganic, this unitary being is the non-existent inner. But the process existing as a unitary being is the organism. The unitary being, qua a being for self or negative being, stands in antithesis to the universal, draws away from it, and remains free for itself, so that the notion being realized only in the element of absolute singleness and isolation does not find in organic existence its true expression, that is, to be present as a universal, but remains an outer, or what is the same thing, an inner of organic nature. The organic process is only implicitly free, but is not explicitly free for itself. The being for self of its freedom appears in purpose and exists as another being, as a wisdom that is conscious of itself and is outside of the process. Reason in the role of observer thus turns to this wisdom, turns to spirit, to the notion existing as a universality, or to purpose existing as purpose, and henceforth the object before it is its own essence. Now we see this three-part movement working again as Hegel summarizes some of the previous developments in paragraph 341, beginning with observation of inorganic nature, and then moving to observation of the organism, and finally looking at what the culmination, actually not the culmination yet, because that's going to come in later sections, but the culmination, at least here, of the observation of individuality that's been going on in the last two sections. The short section that we had prior to this, and then this entire section of the phrenology and physiognomy, right? So we have this development of the in itself and some sort of estrangement, alienation if you like, an Entfremdung, and then some sort of hopeful reconciliation. Now there is a reconciliation that's taking place because we're moving through the phenomenology, but it's quite possible for somebody to get stuck and never make any progress beyond that. And what Hegel says is we begin in this survey. He says we begin with observation of the relations of inorganic nature, right? And in doing so, I'm going to sort of skip through this a little bit. He says that what we ultimately end up focusing on is the universal. There really is no interiority as such that would be opposed to exteriority in any meaningful way for inorganic nature. It's only when we get to the organism that the inner begins to matter. Because the inner for minerals, we just cut them open and break them down and we can see what we want. So that's where we began. And we saw that the universal is really important for that, right? He says that we have simple notions which should be firmly tied to the existence of things, but the existence gets lost. And the movement demonstrates itself to be a pure movement and a universal. And he says the free process, which is complete within itself, retains the significance of something objective, but now appears as a unitary being. In the process of the inorganic, this unitary being is the non-existent inner. But the process existing as a unitary being is the organism. And we had all these discussions about teleology and life and purpose. And it was very, very interesting, wasn't it? To see how it goes beyond observation of organic nature. And to see that these notions that we often take for granted as we're doing philosophical biology or even anthropology are they're a little bit murkier than we grant them to be. Sometimes we think we've got them down more. And what was the ultimate clash that's going on there? It's the individual versus the universal. He says, the unitary being, qua a being for self or negative being, stands in antithesis, in opposition to the universal. draws away from it and remains free for itself. So now, the notion, which is what we're looking for the entire time, the G.W.F, right? Being realized only in the element of absolute singleness does not find in organic existence its true expression. What is its true expression? To be present as a universal, but not to be present as a universal in this way, to be present as a universal in another way, as a concrete universal, as Hegel will say at different points. Not explicitly in this paragraph, but at different points. So now he goes on and he says, the organic process is only implicitly free. Right? There's something, we've seen this before. Life does not, as Hegel says, have a history. Not as life itself. It's only when life is transformed into something more than mere life, into spirit, into the notion, or at least trying to get there, right? Not necessarily fully there. But it's only when life transcends life that it really matters, that things stick, that we have something that could be a universal. And that is what's supposed to be happening in this observation of individuality. He says, ultimately, we're finding that the being for self of its freedom, whose freedom? The individual. The being for self of its freedom appears in purpose, in Zweck. Now, we saw that already introduced here in talking about organisms. Organisms have a Zweck, an end, a purpose for themselves, right? They become their own purpose, right, at a certain point in Hegel's examination. But it's when we can frame to ourselves purposes that we can talk about with other people, talk about with ourselves, reflect upon, perhaps change, perhaps modify over time, that we can act upon or refrain from. It's that which takes us beyond the realm of mere biology and life, or even natural history, and into determinately human history. So he says, what we've got going on here, the being for self of its freedom appears in purpose and exists as another being, a wisdom that is conscious of itself and is outside of the process. Now that's going to happen way at the end, right? But Hegel's hinting at what's going on already here in this paragraph. So he says, reason in the role of observer thus turns to this wisdom. It's sort of like it's sighting it from a lighthouse far, far away, right? And it turns to spirit. It turns to the notion existing as a universality. Or purpose existing as purpose. Zweck existierenden Zweck, as Hegel says. And henceforth the object before it is its own essence. Where are we going? We're getting to the point, I don't want to give too much away at this point, but it's very interesting. We're getting to the point where what's going to be happening is reason, or the rational being, focusing upon itself, no longer just, looking at its bones or stuff like that, but looking at what it does, what it thinks about itself, how it connects itself with other human beings in its culture, what sense it makes of itself, what it has to say about itself. And that is going to be where the development is going to take place in the sections yet to come.